Okay. Idamix ganotani uki nistu anago Cassie Ayoungman nik dumadutu Siksika Nation. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here and listening to our panel today. So we are here at a defining moment. Questions about land, about who gets to make the decisions, and about whether Indigenous voices are truly heard. And there are not these are not new questions, but they are being asked louder than they have ever been. I spend a lot of time in spaces where land access and Indigenous voices come together through my work. And that's through Miistaki, which we're being on the land, in consulting with Indigenous and bringing that practices into our programs. It's a lot like the conversations we're about to have today. And so today's session, Indigenous nations, treaties, and the separation conversation. It's not about taking sides. It is about making sure that as Alberta navigates its future, the foundation that this province was built on, treaty relationship, is not left out of that conversation. I am honored to be joined by these three folks here that bring depth, experience, and community to this discussion. So first off, I would like to introduce Chad, who is right beside me. He is from the Miistaki Anishinaabe community and is of the Atik Dodim. He holds a doctorate in political science from the University of Alberta and is currently an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And here we have Tim Fox, who is a member of the Kainai Nation, which is part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, where he's making his home here in Mohkinstsis, Calgary. He is the Vice President of Indigenous Relations and Equity Strategy at the Calgary Foundation. And thirdly, I'm sure some of you have met him already. This is Wesley, who is a traditional knowledge keeper, sacred pipe carrier, community leader from the Good Stoney First Nation, and resides in Bighorn. So three of us here. We're gonna go right into our audience poll. So here we have the question: when you hear the phrase treaty relationship, what comes to mind first? So feel free to scan that QR code, and having it live, we're kind of gonna see where the audience stands on that. Okay. Awesome. So shared responsibility. I think today we're going to have some great conversation. And, I hope today that you walk out of this room with something you can share with others. So my first question today is for Chad here. Chad, you have studied Indigenous peoples. You study how Indigenous people engage with Canadian political institutions. From a research perspective, is the system designed in a way that makes genuine engagement possible, or are Indigenous communities being asked to participate in a process that wasn't built for them?
Thank you. That's a good question. From what I've assessed and looked at, it can depend on the time. It can depend on what's going on. We saw some interesting things during what we could call Canada's version of reconciliation era during the Trudeau government. And I say it that way because we know for many First Nations people, many nations, it wasn't necessarily equated to what their version of reconciliation also included. And we saw going into the 2015 election a lot of encouragement by parties, by elected officials to have more Indigenous people get involved. And some did. We saw a huge turnout. We saw a great number elected in 2015. But if you look at what we can find on Indigenous involvement, especially in institutions like participating political parties, there's a high turnover rate. It's very quick because there's issues that some of them run into when they're in there. The structure is not built for them. It's not built for us. And depending on how they're going about including us, there's only so much that they're willing to push. And we see this from some of the conversations that have been had. We see this from Melanie Mark in BC when she left the NDP government. We see this with Mamluk when she left as MP for Nunavut. We need to also remember that a lot of these institutions and structures that are put in place were built to make sure that we were othered and not included, because it was decided that what had to be done for us had to be done for us, and we weren't allowed to be included with that. We're talking about participation and belonging and dialogue. That conversation needs to be had, because when we're looking at citizenship and participation, by participating in the Canadian state, it legitimizes the state. That state has also been doing whatever it can for many times to delegitimize us, not recognize us, tell us who's one of us, tell us how we're allowed to govern ourselves, tell us what we are allowed to do with the territories, and interpreting how our treaties are. And citizenship especially, we need to remember First Nations people status. First Nations people only become citizens in 1960. Before that, if they did, it was forced. They were told that they were no longer allowed to be part of their own nation. They no longer had identity. So citizenship granted to us isn't so much about becoming and being part of it. It was looked at as a way of trying to deal with socioeconomic issues while also trying to assimilate and integrate us. For Métis people, the promises of the Manitoba Act were supposed to recognize Métis rights, but we see a tyranny of the majority, the democratic majority, taken away from that and chipping away from it. For Inuit people, citizenship is granted to them not to treat them like they're equal, but for sovereignty issues in the north. They're treated like human flagpoles, but they're also not given ballots and ballot boxes until about 20 years after they're actually allowed to vote. When we see people go involved, they have to work through the party system as well. They have to work through the institutions that are there. And those institutions are built to legitimize the Canadian state, not necessarily us. And we even see that with the courts. When we're having dialogue with the courts, the rulings usually tend to be from a Canadian viewpoint, through a Canadian lens. It's protecting them. And even when we see discussions about changing things, we're told it is an equal process, but we're supposed to pick from a very specific box that Canada's already told us to pick from. So going forward and having that dialogue, we need that dialogue. We need to have those conversations, because that will allow us to have conversations about sovereignty, about representation, and how we are supposed to coexist and have shared responsibility in regards to land, reconciliation, and legal obligations.
Thank you. There we go. And for Tim, you've described a pattern you've observed over the years where Indigenous communities have had to turn to protest, rallies, and organizing just to be heard. Can you walk us through what that pattern looks like from your perspective? What does it tell you about the state of engagement in this country?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll try to answer it in two parts. So I think what I was talking about when I refer to a pattern is you just have to look back through history, back to the past system, back to residential schools. So every time something significant a circumstance has impacted the Indigenous population, through no acceptable means of conversation are they heard. And I think this is important for the general public to know, because I think that's the optics that you see, is you see the rallies happening, you see the protests happening without any context. And that's the pattern I was referring to, that just to be heard, just to have these issues brought to light and addressed, not even addressed, but like talked about in public discourse, it has to go to that means. So I guess what I'm seeing is a lack of engagement, like proper engagement, or if there is proper engagement, it's very one-sided. I think when it comes to consultation, there has to be an openness to either slow things down, or return power, or give power back to the community. But these conversations and this consultation is very one-sided all the time. It's often already decided how it's going to end. So that's why there's these movements, this uproar. And I just wanted to bring that to light, because I think Canadians in general just see that side of it, and they don't see the context that's needed behind that. So that's the pattern that I was referring to. And what I think that tells us about relationships is that we still have a long way to go. I was speaking to some colleagues last night over dinner, and we were talking about the TRC. And I think generationally, right now, I believe that we're still heavy in this truth-telling movement phase of the TRC. I think we're so conditioned to identify a complex issue and problem and immediately try to find the solution. Like, what's reconciliation look like? When do we know when we're going to be done? I don't think it's that straightforward, because of that relationship that needs to be built over time. So being aware of these issues, being aware that there's original people to this land. You know, when the treaty was signed, Indigenous people didn't surrender any land. When Alberta's identity came into fruition, or when it was born. So I think that's a really important, you know, thing to consider, that it's not going to be that easy. The relationship, it's getting better. I'm glad to see that there is a lot more focus. There's a lot more conversations happening about, you know, how to repair things of the past. Next year, 2027, is really important here in Treaty 7 because it's the 150th anniversary of the signing of Treaty Number 7. So I think it's even more so important to, you know, really engage into these topics and this discussion.
Thank you. I feel with these conversations, we probably could talk on because there is so much to be said. And, you know, with the time frame, I feel like this is just going to fly by. And that leaves us with Barry. When you sit across from a table from a government or industry representative in your consultation work, is there a moment you can remember where you felt truly heard?
Just before I answer your question, I just got to speak my language. As I mentioned, you know, nature understands our language, so I have to introduce myself to the land. With that question, that's a good question. You know, we've been lobbying as Stoney people that we needed to be heard. However, you know, we are Treaty Number 7 signatory. However, my community is right on Treaty 6 territory, so that's kind of like a challenging when it comes to land acknowledgement, we're being missed out, you know, and yet the other treaty number lies right on my territory. So we have to go out and speak in these different level of governments, and that's how I became to speak out. And also, there was opportunity that came to me because we used our protocols by meaning that, you know, when we do something, we got to offer tobacco and do our ceremonies and then move forward as my ancestors have done it, and today we're still practicing that protocol. So we've done that, and then we move forward to start setting up meetings with different level of government. And the first one was the federal government, the national park, and we've been requesting meetings, and we finally got it, and we got our park passes. You know, we were not allowed to go into the national parks, probably across Canada, without a pass, or you got to pay. So in this case, my elder, actually was my mom, she said, you know, Barry, you got to do something about this. I cannot come right in my home and sneak around to collect medicine. That's what she told me. This is not right. Do something about it. So I've done that. First I did protocols. I asked, what do I do? Give me directions. So we did our ceremony. I asked our ancestors and our grandfathers and grandmothers in the ceremony, give me directions. What kind of approach should I take? They didn't give me any direction at all at the ceremony. All they said was, it will come. You go and make those connection phone calls. So at that point, I made the phone calls. Guess what? They were waiting for my phone call. So I made the phone call, our first connection. Then from there, we start moving forward. So through negotiations and MOUs, we got our park passes. So And no, it wasn't just for my community. I spoke on behalf of Indigenous people in Canada, including the Métis. So within 2 years, we got our first passport. All of a sudden, I got a phone call from Jasper National Parks, and I got a call. Hey, Barry, we got something for you. Come get it. So I went to the town of Jasper, and sure enough, my passports were there. Pardon me, park passes. And they gave me at that time, it was Aboriginal pass. It wasn't Indigenous. So they gave me the first park passes. It has 0001, and I was told, you hang this up in your wall as a memento that was a milestone. And from there on, every other national parks and provinces follow through. So to me, that was my first voice. So in a later time, I continued, I need to bring my traditions, practices back into the Crown land. That was the next one. So I've done that. I spoke and spoke. I did the same practice. I did the same route, and before I know it, I was invited to do a presentation at the House of Commons in Ottawa. That was a big step. So throughout my work, I've got to do, and today, I felt that our voices are heard, not just my nation, that including the mountains, because that's where I'm from. The mountain speaks through me. So I just want to share that, and this is why I like my job really, really, very, very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Yes.
Okay, so going back to Chad here, for a lot of Indigenous people, this isn't an abstract political debate. It's about land we've lived on since long before any province existed. How do we make sure that reality doesn't get lost in what is becoming a really loud political conversation?
Okay. Part of that is the dialogue to have with Canadians and have allies help with other Canadians with that dialogue. It's not all our responsibility. It's been on the shoulders for many people from our nations since contact. But it's having some of that conversation and remembering that connection to the territory, and that many of us are from nations that are part of confederacies, and therefore my community is one of 6 Mississauga communities. Our territory is also shared with Haudenosaunee and with Chippewa and Odawa and so on. So trying to understand that is also very important for how we look at boundaries and sovereignty, and where provinces think territories or borders begin and end, and how Canada and the United States thinks of that as well. We come from nations where our territories aren't just fixed between a provincial jurisdiction. And a lot of that comes from misinterpreting and the fact that as time has gone on, there's been a narrowing of focus, a Canadianist focus on how we exist and what that means territorially, what sovereignty means, and our connection to our territory, if we've surrendered it or not. Sovereignty for a lot of Indigenous people does not mean fixed borders and full control over territory. How do you own something that also is alive? It's about being able to be self-sufficient. It's about being able to exist. And we forget that sometimes with that conversation, or that need for that conversation. So there's a lot of fear over land sovereignty. We see this with BC over the ruling that happened, the Cowichan ruling that happened regarding land there, and how that has been stoked. We've seen that happen in other places. We've seen that even back in my territory with the Grand River area with 6 Nations. So trying to have a conversation about the connection with it, and that we may not be within our reserve boundaries, but some of us still live in our territory. Toronto is my family's traditional territory. So conversations like that are very important. It's reminding about that connection and also reminding about that treaty relationship. But that treaty relationship doesn't just start with the Royal Proclamation. That does not just outline everything. A lot of people forget and don't fully consider the Wampums of Niagara in 1764. There's another half to that story that gets forgotten, because when you read the Royal Proclamation on its own, it looks like it is a top-down approach from the British, and then therefore Canada because of 1867. But when you read the Wampums of Niagara, it talks about that nation-nation relationship. You see the bills that actually highlight that and how we're supposed to coexist, not control each other. And that part gets forgotten as we see more rulings come in and more focus, especially through court cases. And we need to, again, remember, the Canadian court system is put in place to establish the state and legitimize the state. And we've seen how the court rulings have been very narrow going forward from that. And this impacts how provinces see their jurisdiction and their rights. We're entering a period of time where we're seeing a provincial rights movement again, but for Indigenous people, that has never not existed, because that tends to be trumped. And we've seen court rulings say that, where in Canada's national interest, Canada, and therefore sometimes when the provinces require Canada to get involved, can override Indigenous rights. It's still interpreted from that one side without considering us. And if we have the proper dialogue, we can see, and there's a lot of cases where some communities like Wet'suwet'en offered an alternate route to a pipeline, and it was not followed. Again, because of how it's looked at. But also a territory is very important for us because of spirituality, ceremonies, also where we've buried some of our ancestors. And when we're doing some of that consultation and that discussion with land, it's also important to not pan-indigenize, because there are differences, and we saw that with some developments with like the Site C Dam in BC. There were two different nations who were being impacted by that. And when we're doing consultation, they like to favor a majority of response. So when you're talking to 8 communities, and 6 out of 2 are okay with it, but those 6 are from a different nation who aren't fully impacted by the flooding that has detriment effect. And that's coming even from, this has been a constant thing, because with nation-building projects, it has usually come at the expense of Indigenous territory, and it's very, very important territory as well.
Thank you. How much time do we have left? Where's our mom? Is it 10:40? Okay. Just want to see how much time we got. So let's go. So this can be a group question, or Tim. I wanted to say, you know, there has been a lot going on recently in the past few weeks. And hold on one second here. Oh, how many? Oh, okay, perfect. We're good then. So Indigenous nations had to have gone to court twice just to be part of the conversation so far. And what does that tell us about where we are when it comes to, you know, meaningful engagement?
Well, I get this question. It tells us that we're not quite there yet, I don't think. I think that these ideas of separatism are surfacing, and there's referendums and all this kind of stuff, and that's the news, and no one's talking about, well, there's another group of people that we have to actually legally consult with, and when it comes down to that realization, then we're treated like stakeholders. When it's like, no, like we signed an agreement that governs a relationship, and that these treaties aren't like historical artifacts to us. They're legally binding, but even more so, I think it's important to realize that overall, I think in Canada, there has been historically a really negative perception about Indigenous people, even today sometimes. So we hear land acknowledgements on the rise or emerging, which is a beautiful thing, I think. It's really showcasing the diversity that exists within Indigenous nations, because again, history has taught us that we are one homogeneous group with one set of values, one language source, and that's not the case. Growing up, I learned about Indigenous people, but I didn't learn about my people. I didn't learn about the Siksikaits at the B. So everything that has happened through our history has been strategically designed, is what I believe. And I don't know if you know Michelle Good. She's a Cree author. Have you heard of Michelle Good? So she just wrote a book, and you could write this down. It's called Truth-Telling, 7 Conversations About Indigenous Life in Canada. It's a really good book, and she touches on this. She touches on this perception of Indigenous people. I think this perception matters because this is part of the reason why we're left out of this meaningful engagement, left out of the conversation from the beginning. In her book, you know, she can tie pretty much all these deficit statistics to a historical situation that has happened or has impacted First Nations people, Indigenous people across the country. So I think, you know, first of all, we have a lot of awareness. I think the general public, like I said in my previous answer, we're experiencing this generation of truth-telling. I don't know, just by show of hands, who here, just by show of hands, has had to deliver a land acknowledgement? Raise your hand. So I think, like, that's an example of a system that is changing, because, you know, years ago we didn't see that. And another really exciting thing is that I think there's a new kind of leadership emerging in a younger generation, because a lot of times kids are going home and they're educating their parents about land acknowledgement, so that's really a beautiful thing. But even that, land acknowledgements aren't simply about pronouncing community names, right? I think land acknowledgement requires a level of relationship that needs to be built. So if you are living on some traditional lands, if you are interested in decolonizing, you know, entering a process of decolonizing, I would start with your introduction. And the next time you are invited to introduce yourself, you know, start with the ancestral or the traditional territories of where you were born. If you weren't born in this country, I would sort of do some work of relationship building and just acknowledge a frequent place that you live. I think that's a really good first step. But we have a long way to go for meaningful engagement.
Thank you. So Barry, or this could be to the group as well, the theme of the summit is from divide to dialogue. Based on what you've seen, what would it actually take to get from where we are now to a place where Indigenous nations and non-Indigenous Albertans are generally in dialogue about the future of this province?
Sneeze. You know, I've done a lot of research for my nation, so I'm just going to go back in history. In 1877, our nation signed Treaty Number 7. It was a treaty. Today, that's a living document. And as we progress, but before we signed that treaties, there was already an act in the government of Canada, which Indian Act. So there's two. So there is two, the treaties, and then there's the Indian Act. So under the Indian Act, my language was assimilated. They were trying to take away my language. Okay. So that was the first one. And then before we know it, we have a reserve. In Canada, you know what an Indian reserve is. And we were put there, and the only time you're going to leave your reserve is you got to have another passport to get out to our own territory, I guess, our lands, just to live our lives. Our way of life was being shot down and closed right in front of us. And as we progress, and then another government was born. I think it was in 1905 or 1907, called Alberta, talking about here, was born. So when we were born, you know, as Indigenous people, we were in a moss bag, first thing, when you're introduced to Mother Earth. But in 1905, 1907, there was another form of government was born, but it wasn't in a moss bag. So therefore, that government just grew really fast. And it has an effect on us as original people across the province. And moving forward, we finally, under the Indian Act, we were able to leave our reserve without a passport. So from there on, our people were traumatized. First, there was a uniform was arresting our people by leaving the reserve. So every time, so moving forward again, those uniforms exist today and in different forms. So that's how when we were trying to go to the parks, you know, the uniform was so, you know, traumatizing, and they were afraid. And also when you go to town, you see RCMP or the uniform, you know, it brings back, you know, those back classes from those hard times. And that was being shared through generation to generation, those stories. And so in 1960, and Chad touched on that, that we were able to vote with the mainstream society. At that point, our people were still afraid to go out and vote. And yet, our voices needs to be heard. In reserve life, you hear a lot of complaints, lots of, you know, we do this, do that, you know, who's gonna step it up? You hear that. It's a different world. So as votes come along, you know, every election, we have to go out, especially the federal election, we have to go to our nearest town, which in my case, a little hamlet called Nordic, Alberta. We go there. When you vote, that represents your voice, depending on who you vote for. So, being said that, our community members didn't want to leave the reserve. They were afraid to go vote. Today, I still see that system there. And then this separation, you know, this government I mentioned didn't acknowledge the first peoples, the stewards that take care of this land, not managing it, take care of it and build and continue having that relationship. But the government forgot all about that, and also the languages. Just because we have the same color does not mean we spoke the same languages. We don't. And that needs to be recognized across Canada. And maybe we need to go there, and so we don't have to face what we're facing today. It's called education. We need to educate and learn our history and move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to add on there with talking about the courts and how we have to go to the courts, that's also only been something in the last 24 years as well. Prior to that, other than a little bit with the Calder decision, courts were making decisions based on us by outside actors, so the provinces and the federal government fighting. How Inuit get labeled as being under federal jurisdiction is a fight between Quebec and Canada in 1939. How it's decided that provinces have jurisdiction over territory and the resources coming from it, and therefore the revenue from it comes from the St. Catharines Milling Company decision in the 1880s, where they decided that once a treaty is formulated, it means a surrender. We weren't a part of those conversations, but the decision affects us going forward. So these institutions have been built without including us, and that is how Canada has. It's been top-down approach, it's been on top of us. And we still know that, we still see that, especially with decisions that are being made. So we see, just quickly, one quote I wanted to highlight, this is from Gina Starblanket and James Rowe in an article with the Tyee. They pointed out Alberta's separatism, rooted in resentment over the province's inability to freely exploit natural resources, relies on the ongoing denial of treaty. This is the same thing across the entire country. It's the same thing with areas that are non-treaty, the assumptions that are made about that, and not including us properly with those discussions. But those treaties exist for a reason, and we forget that because it's easy to try to ignore that now. But that also comes with where dialogue needs to happen. But with that dialogue, Canada and Canadians, provincial governments, political parties, the federal government need to listen with that dialogue, and actually instead of just ignoring it because of votes and so on.
Can I add something too? I think Barry touches on a really important point, and Chad built off of that. But I wanted to highlight the "Idle No More" movement. I think that was a really important, pivotal moment, because what we're talking about here, when Barry is explaining this, I want you all to understand that we're trying to talk about a different paradigm of thought, a different way of life. It's not just sort of, what a fantasy or it's not a nice to have. We're talking about a real living relationship that we have. So "Idle No More," at the very core of it, was about water protection. It was about, these 4 law students coming upon this bill C-45 back then, that would allow access to waterways around First Nations communities. And then it became about, more than that, and a movement was born. But in that same year, I don't know if you all remember this, but Chief Teresa Spence of Attawapiskat was having a hunger strike outside of Parliament. And the reason why she was having that hunger strike is because she just wanted what Chad said. She wanted dialogue, because Attawapiskat was under a boil water advisory. It had been for the last 10 years. She just wanted to sit down with Stephen Harper, David Johnston, to start talking about how can we solve this water crisis. So when I was talking about protests and all these things, we just want to have this dialogue that Chad is, emphasizing, because we want what Barry's talking about, our paradigm sort of valued and taken into consideration. You take a community, you disrupt a way of life. Let's say people just disrupted Canadians, our way of life here, and forced us to sort of assimilate and do all these other things. That's detrimental. And so what we're talking about is generations of repair and understanding for all Canadians, for all of us. I think for myself, I'm not a fluent Blackfoot speaker. I wish I was. But that's another thing that that's another challenge that we have, is having our languages survive. We're very diverse in our languages, and it's so important. I don't know if you know Leroy Little Bear, but he talks about we haven't even tapped into the potential of Indigenous languages, because these Indigenous languages could tell us so much. The other thing that Leroy talked about was when Calgary released their plan to address climate change and get to zero emissions by 2030, I think it was. He was one of the first presenters, and he wasn't giving any solutions. He was talking about you need to encourage citizens to have a paradigm shift, to look at land and climate in relation. Imagine if they had the same respect as Indigenous do, and Indigenous people do for land. We wouldn't sort of be where we're at right now, because those 4 ladies back in Idle No More days, they were protecting water rights, because water has rights, all this kind of stuff. So it leads into so much more and more and more. It builds off of that. But I just wanted to highlight that.
Okay, we're very short on time. We'll open it up to the floor for any questions that you have for the panel. We have one here. Go ahead. I don't know if they have a mic. Right here.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for a really wonderful, enriching discussion. I really appreciate the insights that you brought, and I learned a lot, and I just want to thank you so much for sharing your experiences. My name is Kiona, and I am an exhibitor here with the conference. I represent the Remembering Project, and we are a very new group of non-Indigenous Canadians, and we work with survivor communities in a very respectful fashion. And in short, our goal is to help bridge that gap. We often visit residential school sites when we are invited by survivor communities. We hold treaty discussions, and we help to translate and transcribe archival records. And then, of course, all these are done under the leadership of Indigenous communities themselves. And we are based in Toronto. And my question for you all is, how have you seen Canadians be allies for truth and reconciliation? And also, how have you seen Canadians come to terms with the legacy of the residential school system? Thank you.
I can take it. I'll take that one. Shnees, for your question, you know, this morning I slept right across here, across the street at Hyatt. So this short distance, I don't know how many people I met coming in. Not once, nobody greeted me. Nobody acknowledged me walking through there. So if we continue to do that right across Canada, you know, how are you supposed to fix or help or align with each other? That's very important. We forgot about that. It's called relations and connections. Humility is not here today. We need to bring that back, because that's the reason why today in this country we're fighting amongst government, different levels of government. That's the reason why. We forgot about ourselves. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Shnees.
Just going on with that, it's important to probably learn and know your local area too and what might have existed there. Toronto, at one point, the kids from my community were sent to the Mush Hole, which is the Mohawk Institute. My community, in a lot of sense, by residential school standards, it was successful with what it was supposed to do with my community. My grandparents, my parents' generation were not sent for a reason because they no longer had to be. So the rebuilding of our own understanding started in the late 80s, early 90s. When I was a teenager, I thought the issue was being Indigenous, being Ojibwe, because of how it was looked at. So I planned to enfranchise, because again, when we're talking about this and we're talking about dialogue and understanding, I don't know how many of you are also wards of the state, because technically we still are. So we have numbers to define who we are. But having those conversations, one good point when we're talking about reconciliation is that the TRC bringing some of this forward, this is just the tip. This is just a sliver of the tip of a tiny part of the top of the iceberg that we're talking about. It does not talk about the Indian hospitals. It does not talk about the sterilization. It does not talk about many other items that go alongside with this, or the fact that Canada still tells us who's allowed to be one of us and who's not. So having those conversations and being able to have those conversations is very important, and that includes that dialogue, so it's very important going forward. And starting to realize that we're, again, not all the same in our histories and our relationships, and the history of that contact is not the same as well.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? Okay.
Can I respond to that last one though first? Just so we could build off of this all day. Thank you for the question. So I get questions like this a lot. People will attend some sort of workshop. They will increase their knowledge, which is an amazing thing. I think that's what we have to do. So you're doing the right first steps. But when they come and they ask me, you know, Tim, I heard what you said. I understand it now. I finally get it. Like, what's next? What do I do? Then I respond to them. I say, okay, well, you're going to these residential schools. You're doing all that work that you just explained to me, right? So I would say to you, think of your spheres of influence. Think of your spheres of influence related to your family group and all the people in your family group. Then think of your spheres of influence involved with the people that you work with, your work sphere of influence. Then think of your sphere of influence related to your friendships. Maybe you're involved in some community groups, religious groups, all that kind of stuff. Think of all those people in those spheres of influence. And if you're doing the work, the hard work of becoming an ally, I'll ask you, can you tell me without a doubt in your mind that every single one of those people within those spheres of influence has the same knowledge you now have and motivation to be an ally? The answer is probably no. They will say, that's what's next. That's what's next, because when I'm presenting to school audiences, which I'm going to be later today, I often say, don't let schooling interfere with your education, especially when it comes to this kind of stuff, because we're not quite there yet. And if you're experiencing a shift in understanding, that's an amazing thing, but now you have a responsibility. There's a difference between knowledge extraction and knowledge mobilization. And that's what I would do. I would focus on knowledge mobilization, because if you're coming to things like this, if you're sitting in panels like this, merely just to increase your level of knowledge, you're being no extractive than efforts before, than historical efforts where it's like take. It's what you do with what we're saying to you after, and there's tons of things you could do. You can have further conversations. You could, vote differently, all of these different things. Pay attention when these movements emerge, and if you hear that inherited negative perception about who we are, and you see someone like Barry walking into a conference, say hi, so that's what we could do.
Thank you. I could listen on and on. Seriously, it's just there's just so much knowledge. Is there time for one more? Okay. Who wants to ask a question? There's two people. Whoever wants it. Is there a mic coming? Oh, I guess back there. Okay.
大家好，我係馬婉雅，我係客家學生人。Hello, everybody. My name is Melody Yunyama. I'm Hakka Hoisan, second-generation Chinese, currently a settler on unceded territory on the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. Thank you so much for this panel today. It is an honor to be here to witness and learn from all of you. My question is, the big elephant in the room is fundamentally our democracy is built on anti-democracy. It's built on the dispossession of Indigenous people and disenfranchisement of racialized peoples too. So from your perspective, what do you honestly and candidly think about this white settler colonial democratic system?
Oh, God. My Indigenous side and my academic side are fighting with each other right now. I was also very involved in federal politics for a very long time. I got involved because I thought it was a way to go forward. Some people convinced me to. And, it was very much approached. I was welcomed until I started speaking up. And that's what I hear from a lot of people who get involved. We're told that there's room for us. And I still remember a prime minister from 2015 to 2024 telling me, 2025, telling me that at the 2016 Winnipeg Convention that one should not have to pick between being Indigenous or Liberal. They should be able to be both. But that's not the reality for a lot of people who get involved in the parties. You have to choose, because there's a difficulty in understanding that we're coming from our perspectives of where we are, and when we're talking about our communities and we get involved, we're getting involved because we're trying to make sure things are changed or do better. We're getting involved because we don't have 4 or 5 years to play political chess. We're actually seeing people go missing. We're seeing people who are told that they're not worth anything, being told from a young age that they're not actually smart enough to continue on into academia or into any other field that they're doing. So these institutions and this structure is built that way to other us unless we become a token or poster child that they want. My nation was the poster child of civilizing the Indian in the 1830s and 40s, but we were doing it too well, and then therefore there had to be other rules put into place. So there's always the changing of stuff, and we see the BC government doing that now with UNDRIPA. So I'm very cautious about stuff. I used to be cautiously optimistic, but I am a recovering Liberal since 2018, and I'm no longer involved with any parties because there's not yet the ability to, but that doesn't mean I don't support the people who come up who are still full of energy and able to push for stuff. I support them who are doing stuff. I'm just too tired to do it. I prefer to do the education route. My view became the more people learn, the more dialogue that happens, the more people who are understanding it and will pass that information along and hopefully utilize it going forward themselves. I found more value in that, personally.
That was good to hear your language spoken. That's you. You spoke from your heart. That's your identity. So, when you talk about democracy, so in my case, there's democracy versus traditional values. So for us, we have to continue practice and use our traditional values. That's including my language. That's more important than this democracy that brought to this country, to my territory, and divide and conquer. That's my people, that's how they would see it. That's how they see it today. It creates division. So if you look at across Canada, how many provinces, how many in the federal government, how many different colors represented in that House of Commons? To me, that's division. How are you going to work together? If you always, Elder would say, when you bark at each other's, you'll never get anything done. You're always going to be in that same level. So if you want to move forward, take that time. Listen. Listening is a very, very powerful thing. Do you listen to your parents when you're growing up? Your kids listen to you. All those things you need to, that's part of our traditional values. And it's important. If you do that, even Mother Earth will listen to you. So sometimes we forgot about our values. Every one of you that sits in this room have that, but in a different perspective. Start using it. This way, in the future, we can live a good life together as neighbors and respect. Thank you.
I would just add that when it comes to citizenship isn't equally experienced across Canada. So I would say when it comes to democracy, it's not very democratic. That there's flaws in the system, and that the more you're learning about this, the more hopefully you're passing on that understanding. Because I think it's really important to realize the experience that we are facing and how left out we are being in these really crucial conversations, decisions, all that kind of stuff. I think gone are the days when, we should be expected to sort of assimilate, because there are deficit statistics when it comes to Indigenous population. We hear them all the time. And it's important to know those deficit statistics, but it's even more important to know why they exist in the first place. I think what we collectively have the responsibility to do is to begin to shift that sort of thinking about who we are. And then the other thing that I think we have to do generationally is we have to change our behavior. I do a lot of systems change work, and there's a framework called the Wheel of Change. And the second sort of step in that process is once you learn with your heart and your mind, you should behave differently. It should impact your behavior. So yeah, I'll sum with that.
Thank you. Again, I know that there was a couple more questions, but feel free to ask the panelists after. This isn't easy, but it's necessary. The fact that we're having, these conversations together in this room is a step that in the right direction in the dialogue that we need here. So thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for listening. Again.